This is the Fixer Punk Podcast. I'm Grayson Peltier. If you're wondering where I was last week, I was paying the price for being an idiot and deciding to put off my second COVID booster shot because I thought I had been infected back in November, and an antibody test seemed to conclude that I was off the charts in antibodies. So my primary care doctor agreed that I could wait a little bit on that, and I just wound up not getting it. And then, stupidly enough, a family member told me that maybe I should stop wearing my mask in the gym. So I did that, and boom, I got the virus. It is a terrible experience, and I was feeling very, very scared the entire time. I didn't know if I'd be able to come out of it. I feel like I'm almost out of it. Still have some soreness in my lungs and stuff like that, but tested negative now. And I was scared that I'd come out of it with the long COVID and basically be turned into a vegetable, like most of these horror stories with long COVID. So just please avoid it. Don't assume that something has protected you that when it's not, if you haven't actually gotten the second booster shot. And I got on the Paxlovid. Has some side effects to it, but not too bad. Would definitely recommend. And I was going to do a Fixing the Fixer Punk episode this week, but a lot of the things that I would complain about really don't feel all too significant after having a close brush with death. There are still some things to work on. Definitely going to be some material for next week. But I want to get to a very, very serious issue that is affecting a lot of people right now, that has a very serious impact. And it's top of mind, apparently, because there were multiple stories on it in this past week's Sunday LA Times, and that is housing and homelessness. And there are multiple stories. In one issue of the LA Times, you have 3 stories about it. So on the front cover, you have a headline talking about just how deadly this crisis is. It reads, heat exposure illness deadlier for unhoused people in LA. They account for nearly half of such deaths countywide, coroner's data from last year's show. So this is a problem that is pretty obviously literally killing people. And they discuss some of the stories of the people who've died. They discuss some of the possible solutions, including like cooling centers during the day, and how homeless people have a hard time finding a place where they can get into air conditioning, and of course the impacts of climate change, the fact that because there's a warming climate, a lot of people are going to be affected by heat and have heat-related illnesses, which is going to become, it's actually already like the leading cause of weather-related deaths, more than like hurricanes and stuff like that, which I found to be a little surprising. But it's the truth, and it's going to become even worse with climate change. And then you have on the other side, like in the middle of the newspaper, you have a story about how interest rates are basically making the housing market extremely chaotic, that even as interest rates go down, affordability isn't necessarily going up, although in pockets, randomly it is. There are random houses that are being sold for a lot less. As somebody with a real estate license, there's a lot of variability in the desirability of houses, and a lot of people that were pricing very high, a lot of people that are engaging in games when the interest rates were low to try to get the house price up through blind bidding by underpricing. And now there's some inventory that's sticking around on the market, but it's not making things a lot more affordable for people on net, though there are a few surprises there. And of course, that's only talking about the housing market for the people who can afford housing, which we're talking mostly the upper middle class, really, people with good credit and all of those ideal factors. There are some ways around it, and thankfully it seems like there is a little bit of traction for those who have made some progress financially, have the money, but maybe they don't have like the 20% down that you need for a conventional loan, because they're asking for perfect qualifications. There's all cash offers going around. In the prior market, when we had much lower interest rates. But now maybe sellers will consider people who have FHA loans, things like that, and they're using down payment assistance, and that is a positive development for those that can use it. Maybe there are some people in the working class that have saved up enough that they can use that, and they can buy their way into some protection against the menace of homelessness that is literally killing people. But again, it's very, very grim hope, in my opinion, if you can maneuver this excessively complex system and the randomness of the power of capital that happens to be occurring on that particular day, then you can avoid that scourge, and you can level up so that perhaps your family can have a paid off house and the next generation doesn't have to worry as much. Uncertain, trifling hope. But then you get to the end of that same issue of the LA Times, and you get to a story about NIMBYs and what is actually causing there to be a shortage of supply of housing, because we have a terrible shortage of supply of housing, and that apparently is driving the affordability crisis. Partially, I definitely agree with the authors that is a big, big factor. The authors in this article they say that large-scale development is the only answer. Big, for-profit, I don't think they use the word for-profit, but that's what they're implying. Big, for-profit real estate development companies are the answer to the crisis of housing, which in a way, in a highly capitalistic sense, that kind of sort of makes sense. But really what's going on here is actually multiple problems, but they're all interconnected to each other. And the solution that these authors propose, which it relates to the fact that local zoning codes, it is all a continuum. It's not dichotomous. It's all continuous. There's a huge continuum of problems going on here. You have people who are priced out of the housing market, people that for random forces can't get into a solid home. They're stuck in the rental market, where landlords are arbitrarily and capriciously doubling rent and bragging about it on social media. And then those people that couldn't buy a house, got stuck in the rental market, got stuck in the wrong circumstances, those people wind up in their cars. And even people that are living in their cars are not immune to the epidemic of heat deaths. They said in the LA Times story, a story of somebody who was living in their car and had a heat-related illness and passed away from it. So it's all a continuum. Of course, the thing that we have to think about here is we have to understand that there, at that top of the pyramid situation where you could potentially be in the market for a house, maybe what these authors are saying, these authors, Edward Glazer and Ada Tarky, saying that large-scale development firms are the answer, maybe that is part of the answer. They contrast it to the current approach in California, which is to authorize more accessory dwelling units of a person building a second home on their current lot, which has a lot of restrictions, and you have only less than 1 in 5 applications in Los Angeles for that being approved. And so that has not turned out well, but they're saying, well, economies of scale, efficiency. Just like we manufacture every other product, we should be manufacturing housing in that same way. And that does make some intuitive sense. It's going to bring down costs on the margin for probably the upper class people, because even upper class people are having trouble affording housing. People with good salaries. There was actually a really good letter to the editor in a prior week's edition of the OC Times, where somebody was writing in about Huntington Beach specifically, where the mayor who's now in a bit of a feud with Governor Newsom, was saying California's lost 120,000 people. We don't need to build any new housing. And what this letter to the editor says is that the rent burden of living for a kid who grew up in a home in Huntington Beach, if they get a really good job, their rent burden is going to be 60% of their salary. And she doesn't blame them for moving out of state. And they're having to, when they want to come home and visit their parents, they're having to fly in. And certainly that is a problem. High-skilled, talented workers leaving a particular area, people who've had family ties to a community having to leave because the housing is just not affordable, that's a big problem. And maybe some of this market rate stuff would help. And the other issue that the editorial that I'm talking about, the editorial that calls for this large-scale development talks about is zoning laws, which in California, and the reason why you have these worked-up mayors like the mayor of Huntington Beach, the mayor of Manhattan Beach, is that every city in California is required to show an amount of housing that they are going to build in their city to keep up with demand. And part of that has to be low-income housing as well, but they just have to generally expand the amount of housing that they have available in their cities. And a lot of communities don't want that. They don't want more housing in their community, especially don't want low-income housing, because they're like, I don't want to be near those people. I don't want to be near those people. Those people are scary. Meanwhile, it's the people that are doing work in your neighborhood. One of the people, and even we go to the extreme of people facing homelessness. Obviously, this lady's letter to the editor in the Huntington Beach, regarding Huntington Beach in the OC Times, was actually referring to people that grew up in that neighborhood, who lived in that community, who had ties to that community, who would be the ones that are able to get the extra added affordable housing. Like her kid or her grandkid who works in the area and wants to have their own place. But we go to the extreme of even people who are living on the streets. There are plenty of people who are living on the streets who are working in our neighborhoods, who are doing work in our neighborhoods that's important. One of the people who died of heat stroke was working on an infrastructure project, putting in high-speed internet cabling, which is one of those types of infrastructure projects that Biden talked about during the State of the Union. So they're doing important work, and work that the president is even touting in the State of the Union, and they're not able to afford a place to live. And they're potentially dying as a result of that, from heat stroke or having all kinds of other adverse health outcomes. And these are people that are already in your community, but you're like, no, I don't want to be around those people. And that's what the NIMBYs are. They're like, okay, this is going to bring down my property values. This is going to bring down the value of my nice picket fence single family home. So I don't want any more development in my area. And I certainly don't want any low income development. And the authors, of course, they say, well, we need state laws and strong remedies like the builder's remedy, which basically allows builders to come in and just start building without a city permit if the city is withholding permits that they need to put in order to have enough housing to meet state requirements. And that's I'm going to say that's a good thing, that builders are able to do that. They're able to build more housing for those that need it. Probably going to help a bit. But what it's not going to necessarily help is the people at the bottom of the economic totem pole. These large developers oftentimes are also financially exploitative. And sometimes they'll do large housing developments, but they'll do them only for rentals. They will build entire communities like Blackstone, through that this company Invitation Homes. They were building entire neighborhoods that were just all single-family houses, not talking about apartments, single-family houses, all for rentals. Never to be sold, never to give the family that wealth building opportunity, the ability to have the stability that after you're done paying off that mortgage, Your kids have a place to stay in. Your grandkids have a place to stay in. Nope. All that equity appreciation is going to Blackstone or whoever now owns Invitation Homes, because apparently they sold their stake in Invitation Homes. So that's part of why we can't just rely on large-scale private sector development, is because it's not actually going to help those who need it the most. And besides, the private developer, they want to make a profit. They're willing to concede. The reason why some of these private developers, like the Manhattan Beach one, like somebody's getting very close to being able to build in Manhattan Beach against the will of the city government, they got to that position because they're willing to offer some low-income housing in their development. And that's a good thing. But that is because of regulation. That's because of the government. And that's because there are laws saying, well, if you're going to take advantage of this builder's remedy thing, you have to have low-income housing. So this isn't just some simple economic supply and demand thing, because developers are naturally just going to want to do whatever's going to make them the most money. And taking somebody off the streets, even if 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, maybe they were doing well enough economically that they were just on the line. Now they've crossed the line and they don't have the money. And there are so many people who are on that line who are just not considered viable for people that are doing rentals. And that's why if we're going to do large scale developments, sure, right now the mechanisms, the means of production is in the hands of private capital right now. So until and unless there is some massive transformation in the economic system in the country, or we manage to pile a ton of money by way of the SBA, HUD, FHA toward cooperative and nonprofit housing developers, and they can do these things at scale, which is what I think is probably the best outcome, is cooperative and nonprofit housing developers being able to build these communities at scale. We're going to have to right now deal with the private sector. So what we want to do is, if we're going to allow these types of large-scale developments, we're just not going to be able to just do that through letting the private companies run rampant. It has to be regulated, but there also has to be not just regulation. We have to make sure that this is actual housing stock that's going to be sold to people, and to the people who are excluded from the market. We have to be intentional about it. And during that housing boom there, the people who are being excluded from the market are the very people who have the most opportunity to build the best wealth and to have the best outcomes from having their own house. That being those who are buying with FHA and down payment assistance programs. And new housing developments. This is the thing about new housing developments. And I know this as a real estate agent, but a lot of people don't know this until they walk into them. New housing developments tend to, number one, they try to cut out real estate agents. They'll still give them a commission, but they have their interesting machinations of lowering the commission for real estate agents. And agents are very important to somebody who is maybe new to the whole process of signing complicated legal documents for a house, because they're able to guide them through it. But then number two, and more importantly, is they tend to have their own standards in terms of mortgages and in terms of credit pre-approvals. They either make you cross-qualify, which means you have to fill out 2 credit applications, one with their lender and one with your lender, or they make you use their lender, which is a mortgage company that they basically own, the new housing developer owns. And those companies aren't going to offer necessarily the best terms, and certainly not for somebody who meets like the minimum credit criteria, which there are a lot of people. There are tons and tons of people out there who could theoretically buy on an FHA loan and on a down payment assistance program. So like in California, it's called Cal HFA. But nobody's going to sell you, or at least until recently, nobody's going to sell you a house on those terms when they have an all cash, full ask, appraisal waived, inspection waived buyer. When these things require an inspection, an appraisal, all kinds of approvals, documentation to get FHA and down payment assistance and all that. So if we're going to let private developers, sure, let them do large scale, let them do economies of scale, let them build a crap ton of housing. But you have to make sure that housing is available to be purchased by FHA buyers. Make sure your community is qualified, because that's the thing with the FHA. You have to be, if you're going to put an HOA, which a lot of new housing developers do that, positive and negative things about that, kind of a mixed topic, mixed bag. I'll get into that later. But if you're going to let them do that, then they have to make sure that they're going to be wide open doors to FHA buyers, to down payment assisted buyers, making sure that they're not playing these kinds of games. And that's how you're able to have that kind of large scale development. If you're going to have development that is for rental, then you are going to have the same procedures that we've seen being done for the existing builder's remedy, which is to ensure that a certain number of those are dedicated to low-income housing. But the thing is that when you set up the low-income housing, you've got to make sure that it is truly, truly low-income housing, because there are some low-income housing programs that have a minimum income to them. Like if you don't make at least like sometimes $40,000, $50,000 a year, you're not able to qualify for the low-income housing. So you could have someone who's homeless who has full assistance. Like here in Orange County, there's a program that provides full assistance, 100% rental assistance to certain homeless people who qualify. And they would not necessarily qualify for that low-income housing development. So you have to make sure that the low-income housing element is a substantive, real low-income housing element, and make sure that these are people that are most in need, who are getting access to this, because the builders are getting to build through the state usurping the city's powers by necessity. So it's an extraordinary remedy. It's an extraordinary legal tactic. So you should do some extraordinary stuff to justify us doing that for you. And make sure that these tenants are going to, it's actually going to perform. If you have a Section 8, if you have a homeless voucher tenant, you're dealing with A-grade credit from the government. So they're going to pay you the money. It's just not going to be the huge profit that maybe you wanted. But you're getting to build. And you're getting to actually sell some of that housing at whatever market rate you want to, and hopefully it'll bring down the overall market rate for the high-income, aspirational $90,000 to $180,000 a year guy with a job, or gal with a good job out there. So that is the economics side of this. Is we have to make sure that, right now, under capitalism, I want to move to a point where those large-scale developments, that can be undertaken by a nonprofit, especially if we're talking about rental housing and the construction of apartment buildings and stuff like that. That is not as complicated as building entire single-family communities or entirely new communities on raw land. An apartment building in the middle of a city, not as complicated. That's done by a lot of different companies and a lot of different types of developers, and nonprofit developers have had a great history with those types of properties. So we want to give those opportunities to nonprofit developers. We want to have that investment in there. And the authors like to talk about economies of scale. Well, the federal government right now is the number one purchaser of goods and services in the entire planet. So the federal government deciding to shift money using what is sometimes this is referred to as the procurement economy when it comes to government contracts, but I believe it's also applicable in terms of government funding for projects like housing. The government deciding to use its money and shifting it over to nonprofit and cooperative housing developers and to publicly owned housing. That is also an economy of scale and a worthwhile one. And there are a lot of places around the world that have very, very excellent public housing apartment buildings, stuff that would almost be called a luxury apartment here in the U.S. And things that aren't really a blight to their communities like people think about them. The only reason why public housing is a blight is because we don't maintain it. And that brings me to the next important factor, which is the ick factor with NIMBYs. And this is the thing, is that NIMBYs, they create these policies that now we have to create all these workarounds for. They create these restrictive single-family zoning laws. They create these rules that keep those people away. And they ultimately, we go down 5-10 moves on the board there that leads to homelessness, people living in their cars, living in their streets, getting heat stroke and dying. Hence the somewhat clickbaity title here. But that's not just an economics thing. That's an ick factor thing. It's a personal bias thing of people who are upper class, upper middle class, live in these communities, and even though these people are working around them for $15 an hour, serving them their Starbucks or serving them their McDonald's or bagging their stuff at Walmart, they don't want them living in their community for some stupid reason. They're also not too fond of having homeless resources in their community, so when we try to put in like cooling centers or a location, homeless people tend to create their own little communities in a neighborhood. Why there are these encampments? People generally tend to bond to each other and create a sense of community, even when they're in a really hard time. And if you put the cooling center or you put that new housing all the way really, really far away from what they've come to be accustomed to, which this is a concept that especially older people who have a lot of equity in their homes are very used to. They're like, oh yeah, I'm staying in $1 million house, I'm never going to sell it because I like this community, I like this neighborhood too much, and I'm too used to it. But when you think about the homeless people, they just throw it to the wind. But yeah, what'll happen is that people don't want these people around them, and that leads to issues in terms of housing development. That leads to issues in terms of resources. That creates this NIMBYism that is keeping housing where we could put people. Like if we were to go in and you were to propose to a city council today that we should go and we should build some low-income housing near higher-income housing, which is actually statistically, this is the interesting thing, is it's actually best to put low-income housing in higher-income areas because the schools are better and there are better social connections. That LA Times article actually said a child who grew up in a low-income household in Los Angeles' affluent Brentwood earns on average nearly 4 times more at age 35 than someone who grew up in lower-income central LA. So low-income kid, higher-income neighborhood is going to grow up to make more money. But the people in those higher income neighborhoods don't want those people around them. And that is a challenge. And that goes all the way down from this macro economic development kind of perspective through the life cycle, all the way down to resources. You have neighborhoods in Montana who are saying that the homeless people are a network community of bums, which humans make connections. Humans make connections. They talk to each other. They find ways to survive. And that doesn't matter if it's you, me, or the homeless person down the street. And you'll have a lack of, like, in public spaces. Homeless people oftentimes, instead of maybe going to a city-sanctioned cooling center or whatever to get away from the heat wave, they'll go to where they normally go, which is at a fast food restaurant, a coffee shop, or whatever. But they get randomly turned down from these places. That's the thing is that right now, especially in a lot of communities, every third space, every space that's not like your house, there's no place to hang out that's not like a retail business. Everything is like shopping or dining, just shopping or dining. Like I looked at a map of my neighborhood, and I live in a suburban neighborhood in Southern California, and everything is shopping or dining in some way. And shopping, they want you to get in, get into the store, buy stuff, and get out. They don't want people hanging around. And one of the people quoted in the article about the heat wave said that homeless people will oftentimes go into fast food restaurants and coffee shops, and private businesses will act hostile to them even during a heat wave. Maybe they don't realize how much of an emergency it is, how this is like life-saving, the AC in their coffee shop. But they'll act hostile to them. And then and they continue. It's based on how they look and their ability to buy items, and they're even refused bathroom access. So that is the harsh reality, is that people's biases, and of course, if you're sitting next to somebody who you think looks homeless or maybe has one too many bags, some Karen is going to go up to the manager and say, can you get that person out of here? And that keeps happening over and over again, and it's bad for these businesses. And instead of Karen and her thinking leading to, hey, we should build some more affordable housing so that this person has a nice place to live, and we can have one of those nice buildings that looks pretty good and is well maintained. No, it's like, kick them out. They're a bunch of bums with networked resources of knowing how to game the system in order to stay homeless. They're not gaming the system. They're just using resources to survive. And then nobody gets to source the problem. So it is people's prejudices. It is the NIMBY mindset. The NIMBY mindset of, not in my backyard, not in my backyard. I can't have those people around me. That is literally killing people, because on small scale, they're being kicked out of every place where they can be, the library, the coffee shop, where they can be to cool down. And hopefully those cooling centers that City of LA is doing, hopefully those are getting word around, and that they're making sure that people are able to stay in those places, and they're keeping the air conditioning on and getting them into those good public spaces. But it's that mindset. And not in my backyard. I don't want the public housing in my neighborhood. I don't want affordable housing. I don't even want any extra housing, even if it's high-end, upscale, luxury apartments that cost $4,000 a month right now. I don't even want that. So they go write the zoning laws. They're the ones that vote. There's always going to be some small business tyrant with an extra $4,000 to give to a city council candidate. There's always going to be some landlord that wants to keep the rents up, who's going to give them money. So it's a mentality thing, but then it's also a structural inequality created by capitalism, which that's a common theme of everything we talk about around here. It's a structural inequality created by capitalism. You can't really escape it unless you escape it, which is to have systems in place that check the power of capital to charge as high of a price as possible, and only take the absolute highest end gold medal winning buyer or renter and set impossible standards and stuff like that. So you have to use regulation to set those things in place, or you have to give the money and use the power of the federal government in terms of its purchasing and economic power, which unfortunately we're in a divided Congress right now. It's going to be tough to do that, but you have to use that to gear money into community-led organizations, not just regular old nonprofits, but things that are self-governing, and to create self-governing collectives and communities of people who are in the working class. Like, I want a government infusion, a mass government infusion of cash into mutual aid style groups buying housing for each other and creating sustainable wealth for each other by managing housing in a way that is not specifically geared toward profit, but is geared toward caring for each other. And the community can run itself if it is given the right resources to do so, because these homeless people have become so incredibly resourceful. Of course, it's being trashed upon by local mayors or local government like that Montana community who's calling them these networked communities of people that are just trying to live off the system. But you have to look at that ingenuity and that resourcefulness and know that when given resources and some assistance from some people who know, people who are knowledgeable of these things, and people who care, they can create sustainable communities that can exist long term and deliver on the safety needs of the Karens in the community, because they'll be restored. They'll have more normal lives. They won't be in the middle of your sidewalk. They won't be in the middle of your street. They won't be with 5 bags in your local Starbucks, laying around there trying to stay cool, because they already have a home and a place where they can store their stuff and turn on their AC. And that's how you start solving problems. That's going to be it for this week's episode of the Fixer Punk podcast. If you have any comments, or if you have anything else that you want me to cover on a future episode, you can always email me, Grayson, Greyson, at offspeedsolutions.com. We also have a call-in line if you want to call in any comments, have a problem, you want rant about your boss or about some sort of injustice that's happened to you through business, capitalism, society, government, anything really. You can leave that on the toll-free hotline, which is 844-477-PUNK, 844-477-7865. Also follow me on social media. TikTok is very up-to-date at FixerPunk. Instagram is also pretty up-to-date nowadays at FixerPunk, FIXERPUNK. Twitter is at Grayson Nation, GREYSONNATION. There is an article that's going to be coming up soon. It is probably going to get posted on the Twitter first, with the link to that, in relation to self-help and self-improvement for men, which is a topic we've discussed quite a bit here, about men wanting to fight to make their lives better. I have a great case study and a psychological theory that leads us to a more of a muscular psychology concept that can really help break a lot of young men out of mental ruts and challenges in their lives, unlike anything else that we've used to try to solve the men's mental health crisis. This theory, or at least this mindset or attitude that I'm going to discuss in this article, which I learned through a pro wrestling storyline involving Jon Moxley, can really be a breakthrough. So keep an eye out on the Twitter, GREYSONNATION, Grayson Nation on Twitter, and that will certainly be up by the time this episode is up. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you will join us again for the next episode. Subscribe to make sure that you don't miss an episode. And again, I really appreciate your time today.